My Lords, what a pleasure and what a privilege to follow the noble Lord Alton of Liverpool, the breadth of whose interests matches the depth of his humanity. And how sobering that he should have begun by reminding this House of the Holodomor and the horrors and monstrosities experienced by Ukrainians. I was recently reading an eyewitness account of a hideous scene that unfolded in the spring of 1933 in the market in Kherson, and it's almost unbearable to read even after the passage of nearly a century. It was a dead mother with a still living infant trying to suckle the last few drops, and what was most shocking to the observers is that they'd seen that exact scene many times before. It was no longer shocking to them. So I think we can all agree in this House about what's happening in Ukraine, about where the blame lies. This is a territory which was twice targeted by hunger, first by Stalin and then by Hitler. As the Yale historian Tim Snyder points out, it was the most dangerous place to live in the world between 1933 and 1945. I'd like to talk about how we respond. What do we do to lessen the effects of this disaster? And as importantly, what do we not do? First, do no harm. Because something that alarms me is the way in which, in every continent, on every archipelago, we hear people responding in a way that is emotionally understandable but intellectually very dangerous by retreating into the illusion of self-sufficiency and protectionism. People will say, because world food supplies are being disrupted, because prices are spiking, we need to be more self-sufficient, we need to grow more of our own food, we need to be secure in our own supplies. And that, it seems to me, my lords, is the worst possible response. Because if countries around the world begin to do this, they will exacerbate the problem, indeed tip the problem into a spiral of unmitigated calamity. It's happening. Xi Jinping recently summoned a meeting of the rubber stamp parliament in Beijing and said we need to be self-sufficient in food. The lesson we must draw from this is we can't rely on the West. He proposed setting aside 300 million acres of Chinese land purely for agrarian use so as not to have to depend on international trade. Ukraine has, perhaps understandably, imposed a grain export, but it's been followed by other countries across Asia and Africa. And if this carries on, then we really do risk turning a problem into a calamity. What's happening, it seems to me, is that we're responding, as people do, in a very natural, instinctive way. We want to have food supplies close at hand because we're still thinking with our Paleolithic brains. We want to have a hoard of food nearby so as to survive the winter. And we struggle with the reality of a modern globalized economy which depends on this rather counterintuitive, in the literal sense, counterintuitive notion of depending for our key supplies on strangers whom we can't see. And yet, that has been what eliminated famine from the world. It was at the end of the 1960s when countries, particularly in Asia and South America and to a degree in Africa, began to understand that there was a difference between food security and self-sufficiency, that famine began to disappear as a regular feature of our lives. Because the reality is that food security depends on having the broadest range of suppliers, the most diverse group of suppliers possible, so that you are immune to a local shock or disruption which might as easily take place on your own territory as anywhere else. But that goes for a mental blind spot. It offends our inner caveman. It runs up against these inherited instincts. And so, I'm afraid, my lords, I see the world devolving into more and more barriers, and that means more and more hunger. The tragedy is that this war has come just after a pandemic which primed those caveman instincts even more. I was shocked repeatedly during the lockdown by how many people who I had down as reliable free marketeers who were suddenly saying to me, surely, Hannon, even you must now accept the need to grow more of our own food. Even you must see that it's very dangerous to be importing 40% of our food into this country. Really? Really? That's what people got from the lockdown? The lockdown, let's recall, my lords, happened at the end of March 2020, the beginning of what our farmers call the hungry gap, at the time of year when we don't really produce much food in this country. We've reached the end of the winter harvest. We're not producing any more turnips and potatoes and cabbages. We haven't reached the start of the main summer harvests. Between the end of March and the beginning of May, other than rhubarb and asparagus and maybe a little bit of purple sprouting broccoli, we basically don't produce food in this country. But fortunately, it didn't matter because we were able to rely on global markets. And that same lesson applies in spades to countries which are poorer than us. They need to have access to cheap, accessible global food supplies rather than the illusion of self-sufficiency. If I can illustrate this, my lords, maybe you might say in an extreme way, but by giving you, as it were, the countries at the furthest ends of that spectrum. Consider, respectively, first of all, the country that has turned self-sufficiency into its ruling principle, North Korea. Juche, it's called. The idea that there should be import substitution and that you should grow and produce everything possible at home. The last place on the planet that still experiences man-made famines. And then at the other end of that scale, Singapore doesn't produce one edible ounce. Singapore is wholly reliant on imports for its drinking water, for its food, for its electricity. My lords, where would you rather live? Singapore has the cheapest and most secure food supplies in the world because food security and self-sufficiency are not the same thing. And it was understanding that difference that has brought our planet to a level of prosperity that previous generations could not have imagined. And so the worst possible thing we could do would be to turn back the clock decades or even centuries and thereby return to the poverty that our ancestors took for granted. I'm proud to have played some role in persuading our government here to have set the precedent of lifting all tariffs on Ukrainian exports so as to establish a precedent that others could follow, and I was very pleased that 5 or 6 weeks later the European Union followed suit. Now, that is of great value to them at the moment, of course, because they have no sea access and therefore all of their exports must pass through EU territory. But can we not extend the principle, my lords? Shouldn't we, at a time when the world is dealing with a cost of living crisis, when every country, every continent is touched by the scourge of inflation, couldn't we extend that principle and remove barriers, trade and other non-tariff barriers to the free flow of basic commodities such as food? Tariffs and non-tariff barriers on food fall hardest on the people who are poorest, because they have to spend a higher proportion of their income on the basics. The United Kingdom raised itself above the run of nations in Victorian times by being the first place to have unilateral tariff removal and to invite the traffic and commerce of the world without hindrance. Let's live up to what our ancestors did, and let's lead the world a second time.
My lords, it is fascinating to speak immediately after the